Hi, I'm Kohana Wilson. I'm an animator. Today, we're in my home studio, and I'll be demonstrating how to make hand-drawn animations on paper. We'll also use a variety of drawing tools and see how those translate into moving images. Within animation, we have all kinds of different techniques and materials, from stop motion through hand-drawn animation. But the common denominator that kind of connects all of these different materials and processes is illusion. Animation is ultimately a kind of trick of the eye and is the process of stringing together static images in rapid enough succession that they appear as though they're moving and have been brought to life. This works through a really neat optical neurological phenomenon called the persistence of vision. The retina is able to retain an image for a fraction of a second, even after the image has disappeared from sight. It's a little tricky to kind of sort of verbally explain, but I think it's best demonstrated through using optical toys like the zoetrope. This was a planter that I found on a walk around the neighborhood. And all I've done to modify this is added these little strips of paper that turn the squares into slim rectangular viewing slots. Inside the zoetrope, I have this animated strip. And if I spin the zoetrope around and look at it from above, the static images kind of blur into one another and we're not able to make out distinct images. The magic happens when we look through these slim rectangular holes. These rectangular cutouts act as a shutter and the images become an animation. Another optical toy that we can take a look at is the praxinoscope. If you look at the mirrored planes and spin, we can see an animation start. These flat mirrored frames kind of behave like a shutter and allow our eye to, for a moment, kind of linger with these images. The last optical toy I have to demonstrate this persistence of vision is a flipbook. So I have this small gifted flipbook with me of a dancing couple. So with the flipbook, I'm presenting a new frame and holding onto it in this experience that is totally unmediated by a camera. With each of these different devices, we can understand all film, live action or animated or otherwise, is a kind of animation too. So there are a few different tools we'll need for hand-drawn animation. The first is a light source. So today I have my trusty light box. You can use a window on a sunny day. Ultimately, any drawing surface that can be backlit will work for our purposes. The second material we'll need for today is paper. Ideally, you want to use a thin, smooth paper. I tend to use printer paper for most of the work I do. It's not archival, but it gets the job done and is very accessible. And because we're working across so many different frames, having some system of registration, some system of alignment while we're drawing, allows us to make sure that minimal jitter enters the frame as we're drawing. I prefer using this handy tool called a peg bar. To use it, I have a corresponding hole puncher so that when I rest my paper on my peg bar, everything is aligned. Another kind of peg bar that you might see around is an Acme peg bar. They have two wider pegs that flank this one central round hole. This is just another system of registration and mostly a holdover from kind of industrial 20th century animation and require their own hole punch to use them. In Winsor McCay's film, Gertie the Dinosaur, he used little crosses on the corners of the images, and that was his system of registration. So whatever system works for you, feel free to use. There are a couple of different approaches we can take to hand-drawn animation, and the first is known as straight-ahead animation. Straight-ahead animation is the process of drawing your frames in the same order that they play back in a sequence. Well, we're going to demonstrate this idea by taking cue from Paul Klee, who famously said that a line is a dot that went for a walk. With this in mind, we're going to go ahead and take our dot on a walk around the frame. So I'll begin by making the dot feel like it's appearing from nowhere. So I'll start with a very small dot, and I'm just going to number my frames as I go to keep track of them. Now that I have this fresh frame laid over the top, I can see the ghost and the trace of my previous frame and use that as my point of reference for drawing the next frame. So I'm just going to make it slightly bigger and write 2 and continue building my sequence out. As I'm adding frames, it becomes increasingly more difficult to see the last frame I drew. So I'm going to take some of my previous frames off and keep drawing. I find that straight ahead animation works really nicely with abstract sequences, films that aren't necessarily about any particular kind of experience, but are just meant to be experienced in and of themselves. So it's a very improvisational. We're just using the last frame we drew as our point of reference. Now that my dot has grown quite a bit larger, I want to play around with moving it across the frame and in space. The smaller the spacing between frames, the slower the motion will feel, and the wider the spacing between frames, the faster the movement will feel. David Ehrlich's film Coming or Going is an abstract film where we see lines moving across the page, and he really plays with after images, this sort of accumulated trace of the objects as they're moving through the space. It seems to me that he's working straight ahead and just using pretty even spacing as he's working around the frame. If you speak with any animator, they probably have come across the 12 principles of animation. One of the principles that I'm thinking about is squash and stretch. Objects change their width or their height to imply momentum or speed. Another helpful principle to think about is slowing in and out, or easing in and out of different states. So here my spacing is quite tight, and this will translate into slower action. Everything that moves organically or has a life of its own generally tends to move in arcs. If you think of Muybridge's photographs of these iterative states people were walking in or animals were running in, if you track each of those limbs, you get a sort of similar result to what we're simulating here today. You can start to see this motion path move. And because I'm nearing my 24th frame, I want to maybe start thinking about an exit. So maybe I want my dot to shrink back toward the center of the frame. So in animation, particularly with any characters or movements that feel quite complicated, it can be helpful to work in passes, where we start the primary action and kind of doing a secondary pass where we can augment and grow and add to that. So we are going to revisit our frames. When I think of a dot flying through air, I think of a bug, and so I'm going to use that as a sort of point of reference. Maybe it'll look a little bit more like a dragonfly of some kind. I like using pastel pencils because it has its own grit and texture. You can smudge them with your fingers so that I can almost simulate a motion blur. One film that I've been working on, part of a project called Transmission Quilts, is entirely made with these pastels. I'm trying to forego full control, and I'm just more interested in the kind of screen presence of the materials themselves. If you want a quick way of kind of previewing your frames, you can flip through to simulate a kind of flip book. So when I'm working in this way with these different kind of materials, an animator who immediately comes to mind is Mary Beams and her film Tub Film. And so we see the legs of a body in a tub and a very curious cat. She's chosen to use this very fluid, inky material in a film that is very concerned with water and fluidity. So now that our dot is starting to move, I'm also kind of keeping in mind another animation principle known as follow-through and overlapping action. Follow-through is when appendages or limbs connected to a body that is driving the primary motion kind of drag behind that primary motion. And these wings that I've attached are dragging a frame or two behind where our dot is at. I'm also playing with almost like extending the frames to kind of match the squash and stretch frame that I've already drawn. This technique of kind of stretching and extending your frames is known as a smear frame. Smear frames are great to use if you're trying to imply quick speed. In simulating a kind of motion blur is quite literally as though you took a frame and smeared it. And I know because I've just drawn my dot that I'm going to kind of turn downward here. So I'm just letting the back of the wing drag as if it's catching up to the rest of the body. Now I can see that the dot is on the move again. We've kind of increased the spacing between these two frames. I'm going to have the wing kind of stretch a little bit as though it's catching up. Now that the dot is getting smaller, I'm just having the wings follow and kind of rotate up just to follow it into its final disappearance. All right, so now that we're done with this pass, I think I just want to clarify the body of the creature a little bit more, just because we're taking this time to kind of grow it out. Maybe show the tail kind of dragging down slightly and define more of a head shape that comes out. So now our spacing is increased, which means I know that there's speed and momentum being built. Lean into that squash and stretch and really exaggerate. In my first film, which is called Edith and the Tall Child, which was about my kind of very nascent gender reckoning, was also my first time animating by hand, figuring out ways to use materials to imply the physical experience that I was feeling at the time. My dragonfly is back to being small, and the tail has been pretty rigid the whole time. I'm just curving it here to really kind of emphasize that movement. So I'm gonna go ahead and do one more pass. I figure we should also add some legs. Because I want the legs to feel a little finer, instead of using the thicker brush pen, I'll opt for a thinner one so we get a slightly slimmer line. When we were doing the wing animation and thinking about smear frames, I was literally smearing the frames to kind of help exaggerate this idea of a motion blur. But if you're working with a material that's more fixed and more controlled, like the brush pen, you can show multiples of an object to imply that it's smearing across space. I can also kind of exaggerate the width of the legs a little bit more to imply the smear. So our dragonfly is now turning a corner. So the legs are gonna sort of follow that turn. Follow through does take some patience to get the hang of. Watching a lot of video reference and moving through it frame by frame can really demystify any kind of an action. Because we're getting smaller, the drawings are taking less time to do. I think that's a great tip with animation. Sometimes working small can really work in your favor because it takes less time to make the drawings and you can make more in that amount of time. So now that the sequence is finished, I am ready to scan the frames in, but we're gonna cover another animation technique first and then see this come to life after. So the second approach we're going to cover is called keyframe animation or keyframing. Keyframing is the process of drawing key poses or key states, and once you have those key poses clarified, drawing the intermediary frames to kind of link those two key poses together. You're working towards like an end result or a destination and defining the states within this predetermined action. To demonstrate this technique in practice, we are going to animate a cartwheel. I've just begun kind of sketching out what this character might look like in motion. I know that there's a start where we're standing before we're thrust into this very quick rotational movement where both hands are on the ground and both legs are in the air. And then we return to a full stand at the very end. I'm going to start by just roughing out these key poses. And I think in doing this map of the motion we'd like to animate, we can better understand what is happening within this very fast, quick-moving pose. And I'm not being overly precious at this point. I'm more just thinking about getting the gesture of the movement and the kind of skeleton clarified. So this character is standing and maybe leaning back a little bit, so I want the weight distributed onto this back leg. Their back is arched a little bit. These hands have to move down toward the ground in a fast kind of arc. The legs will also move upward in the air in a kind of arcing motion. Keyframing is a really great technique to maintain the proportions across your sequence. I'm also noticing in this pose that I've drawn my foot at a lower point than I've drawn my hand, which wouldn't really make sense. These should be at around the same height because the pose is still the same, just inverted and upside down. So I can always also make reference to how long each of the limbs are in my previous frame and kind of use that as my metric for making sure that things feel aligned and consistent as we're moving across the frame. And now we're continuing the arc of the feet. They'll be in a wider stance to kind of support the body as it's being pulled up. Celebratory and happy to just in a cartwheel. I can start to kind of go back into these frames, maybe just clarify the volumes a little bit more. I like using a mechanical pencil because it's a consistent, really fine line. It's also great that you can erase it. Most of the films I've done on paper have been with this pencil, so we've gone through a lot together. So now that these kind of rough key poses are clarified, I can start thinking about what actions I might want between these key poses and states that glue the whole structure together. And that process of drawing those intermediary frames is known as in-betweening, or making the frames that live between those key poses. So maybe their foot is lifted up slightly. And when they throw themselves forward, the weight is being distributed from the back leg to this front leg. So maybe the front leg bends in order to receive that sudden change of weight. And they're throwing themselves down towards the ground now. And I'd like for the arms to fall behind just a little bit. Maybe their hair is kind of moving behind them. We'll maybe see their hand finally planting to the ground. And their head is now further down. It's traveling in its own arc. I watched many videos for reference in figuring out this motion and breaking down exact points different parts of the body lift up. See the body rearing to return to this last standing pose. And the legs will probably snap up before the rest of the upper body kind of settles into place. So I'll draw the legs straightening out and the body maybe still coming back. These are really rough, very sketchy drawings, but we get to think through motion arcs and this fast, smeary motion that happens in the middle of the sequence. So in the interest of time, I've finished doing sketches that are a little more refined than the very sketchy kind of gestural drawings we just did. Drawing these has just been an opportunity to think about the character design and give a little bit more information. And when I'm in this process, an artist who I always think about is Maria Lasnig. Maria Lasnig was a painter and an animator, and she was known for this approach that was known as body awareness. She would take the time to really think about how that part of her body felt in live time. And the result of that kind of somatic translation is that you see that certain parts of the body in her self-portraits are distorted or, a different color than the rest of her body. It makes so much sense to me that she was an animator or had this predisposition, I guess, to thinking through time and thinking through choreography in these ways too. When I'm roughing out, I'm thinking about the feeling of feet moving really quickly through the air. We see that the feet have gotten pretty huge, but it'll translate in the moving sequence to a kind of smeary frame and put extra emphasis on this movement. So that's what the process of rough animation looks like. We're really thinking about gesture and movement, not overly concerned with the detail, but again, kind of building on this gesture. Numbering your frames when you're working straight ahead is very intuitive. You're just working one frame at a time as they play back in the sequence, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's a little bit different with keyframe animation because we might not know immediately how many frames we need in order to reach the end of our action or our sequence. So my system for numbering frames involves working with odd numbers that have large intervals of spacing between them. This allows me to work with 2 in-between passes, because between 1 and 5 is 3, between frame 5 and frame 9 is frame 7, and to tie all of these together, I can have even-numbered frames that kind of link these images together. The next step after we finished a full rough pass of the animated sequence is going to be cleaning up the line work. So I have done my rough sequence on printer paper. I'm gonna reach now for this animation bond paper. It is slightly warm toned and is quite smooth. So this process just involves retracing the rough line work. And because this is the cleanup line work, this is ultimately what we'll be scanning and documenting at the very end. So here, what I'm mostly concerned with is clarity, and then do another pass where I kind of shade in the individual images. But because we're not concerned with too much detail, I'm gonna add some toenails and add a little bit of shading and texture. So when I'm building out my next clean pose, I can even use my last pose as a kind of reference just to make sure that these smaller details read a little bit more consistently as I work. So I've gone ahead and I've cleaned up all of my rough animation, and now I'm left with these clean frames. So we are going to be scanning in all of these frames one by one, and then bringing them into After Effects to play back our image sequence and watch the still images kind of come to life and be animated. I'm scanning these in at pretty high resolution just to maintain the detail of the drawing. While you're scanning hand-drawn frames in, you want to make sure that you're registering to the same point in your scan bed. So I know that I want to nudge my frames into the top corner. And as I'm scanning in my sequences, I'm making sure that they're numbered in the order that they play back in the sequence, which most scanning programs do automatically anyway. So you don't have to use a scanner if you don't have that available to you. There are free apps you can use that allow you to take photos with your phone or tablet. So if anything, I think the way that you capture your frames has this ability to kind of influence and transform the way your final sequence feels. And when I think about this, an animator who comes to mind is William Kendridge. He'll have a wall in his studio with one large charcoal drawing. He will draw the new frame over the top of the pre-existing drawing. In this walk between the drawing surface and the camera, the film gets built. He's able to kind of think about the next steps, where he'd like the movement to go, and kind of building out the sequence in that walk. So I have After Effects open now, and I'm just going to go ahead and import the images. And I'm going to click and drag my frames to the timeline. I've set this animation to 12 frames per second. And when I play it back, I can see the cartwheel moving through space. So if I wanted the motion to take a little bit more time, I could lower the frame rate. So here I have the sequence playing back at around 6 frames per second. So the movement feels much slower. It's double the length of the 12 frames per second sequence. So you'll notice at the very beginning and end has this really slight jitter. That's referred to as a boil. I redrew my starting pose a couple of extra times. So that leads to these really slight kind of variations in line width and smudging, just so that starting pose would have a little bit of personality, that it wouldn't be one long hold with no kind of internal movement and motion. So now we can scan our straight ahead sequence in using the exact same process and method we used for our keyframe animation. And we can start to see how that dot that we started with is our kind of driving force. We can see the wings kind of dragging behind the body and the legs kind of squashing and stretching as they move through space as well. This end result of seeing all the images stringed together, scanned in, playing back in sequence is just magical every time.